Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webinar tonight. My name is Denis Savelyev. I am an administrator for the Arthur Jeffrey Center of Islam. So I would like to introduce the team behind the webinar tonight shortly, and also to say a few housekeeping rules. So while Bernie will be speaking, Richard, Ash, and I will be chatting with you, and also if we can answer some questions in the Q&A. So Richard is the director of the Arthur Jeffrey Center. Ash is the manager of the communications team at Melbourne School of Theology. And there are a lot of people who registered for tonight's webinar. There's over 1,400 who registered. So Bernie will try to do his best to answer as many questions as possible, but probably won't be able to answer all of them. So if you have questions that you want Bernie to answer, please go to the Q&A session. Feel free to chat with us as well, but the questions that Bernie will be looking at will be in the Q&A. And if there are any questions about AJC in general or MST, maybe some of us can jump in and answer your questions as well. And we also will be posting a few links during the webinar. These are links for our upcoming webinars, and there will be also one link for the page with information on about different things about AJC Center. There will be, for example, there will be a box where you can suggest a topic for another webinar. We would really like to hear your suggestions, what you would like to know about in terms of or anything related to Islam or Christian-Muslim relations. And there are two upcoming webinars, and one is going to happen in 2 weeks' time. It will be presented by Dr. Mark Dury, and the topic of that webinar is how the current Middle Eastern conflict affects local Christians. So Mark will be talking about the modern-day Middle Eastern conflicts, such as the Israeli-Palestinian one, and how it affects local Christians, and also how we can support our Christian brothers and sisters in the Middle East. And in the March next year, Dr. Bernie Power will be presenting at MST an event on using storytelling when we reach out to Muslims. So Bernie has a very long experience. He spent more than 20 years in the Middle East, so he will be sharing a lot based on his and his wife's experiences in the Middle East. So these links will be posted in the chats from time to time, so please feel free to go register to the events, suggest your topics, and so on. And let me now invite Dr. Richard Shumak, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Denis. Yes, my name is Richard Shumak. I'm the director of the Arthur Jeffrey Center here at Melbourne School of Theology. Can I please add my welcome to that of Denis to this webinar? I'm noticing in the chat we have people from literally all around the world, from Europe, from Asia. We have people from Africa, from all around Australia. So it's great to have you with us. I have the pleasure of introducing Bernie. I've known Bernie for many years now. Bernie is uniquely gifted. He's incredibly intelligent and astute. He's he has an amazing way of negotiating the Middle East. He's done that for many years. He is great with people. He's also great at sharing Jesus with people. I'm very privileged to call him a colleague. And particularly his Middle Eastern experience gives him a lot of wisdom to bring to the table. So thank you, Bernie, for sharing with us tonight. I'll hand over to you. And thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll see if I can get my technical stuff going. Share. This one. And it was working before. No, it still is. Great. Okay. Thanks so much, everybody, for turning up. And I hope this will be an informative night for you. I don't think it'll be an enjoyable night because we're talking about a very difficult and painful topic. And as we look at the situation that's unfolding in Israel and Gaza, many people are wondering, how on earth did this come about? What's going on? So tonight I want to give you a bit of ground into this very confusing, perplexing situation, and then draw out some implications for us as Christians. I'll start with two different Christian views about Israel and the Holy Land, views that Christians might hold. I call them view 1 and view 2, and I'll give you some technical names later on. But for view 1 Christians, the answer about Israel and the Holy Land is very simple. They go back to the prophecy of God, the promise of God to Abraham in Genesis, where God says, the whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be your God. So from this perspective, Israel has been given the land by God, and any attempts by others to take it from them are clearly contrary to God's will and purposes. But there's another view out there. View 2 says, yes, the promises were there, but they were always dependent on the obedience of the recipients. Yahweh had warned the people of Israel before they entered the promised land, if you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were before you. And you can see the references down the bottom. There's many others that talk about this concept. But view 1 quickly responds with, yes, they were taken out of the land, but God also promised that they would return. And again, many passages that we can quote, Jeremiah 29, I'll gather you from all the nations and places where I've banished you, says the Lord, and I'll bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. View 2 responds to this saying, yes, they did return after 70 years because God always keeps his promises. But they point to a pattern that was developed by a Christian theologian. His name was H.L. Ellison. He was actually from a Jewish family. He became a Christian. His family became Christian, and he became a theologian. And he points out that the 12 tribes arrived in the promised land after the Exodus. But due to their disobedience, 10 tribes were deported by the Assyrians in 722, and they were lost among the nations. And then in 587, the Babylonians came in and took the 2 remaining tribes, Judah and Benjamin. And in their place, many other nations, people from many other nations were settled in the Holy Land. And so it now had a mixed population. This is where the Samaritans came from. But after the 70 years were over, a remnant returned to the land and they rebuilt the temple. And Ellison points out that there's 2 major themes in the Old Testament. The first one is the increasing sin and disobedience of Israel. And so it's decreasing ability and availability and suitability to be God's chosen instrument, to be a light to the nations. That was what Israel's primary calling was. And secondly, in the Old Testament, we see an increasing number of prophecies about a Messiah, an anointed king who would come and who would fulfill God's promises. So these 2 things are going on. And then he puts these 2 together and he says, at the beginning of the Old Testament, this Messiah is revealed. Jesus says, the time has come and the kingdom of God is at hand. And he chooses 12 apostles to mirror the 12 tribes of Israel. He sends out 70 or 72 disciples, mirroring the number of nations that there were in the nations of the world in Genesis 10. And then he says to them, go and make disciples of all nations. In the Old Testament, Israel was called to be a light to the world. Now Jesus comes along as a fulfillment of that, says, I am the light of the world. And then he says to his disciples, you are the light of the world. Well, view 1 Christians respond to this by saying, yes, but the gifts of God and his call are irrevocable. And they note that the apostles referred to Old Testament prophecies that had not been fulfilled. For example, in Acts 15, James refers to God's promise in Amos 9, where he says, I will return and we will rebuild David's fallen tent. Its ruins I will rebuild and I will restore it, that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles who bear my name. And in the bottom reference there, you see the end times villain, or one of them, the man of lawlessness, who it says will set himself up in God's temple. And they ask, so how can this happen unless the temple has been rebuilt? So a precursor to the second coming of Christ must be the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem by the Jews. Jesus had also talked about the Jerusalem would be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And Paul says, all Israel will be saved. And these view one Christians claim that view two Christians are engaging in what they call replacement or supersessionist theology, where the promises to Israel are taken from the Jews and are given to the church, to Christians. View two Christians respond, they say, no, it's not replacement theology, it is fulfillment or completion theology. Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. And Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, no matter how many promises God has made, they are yes in Christ. And so it goes back and forward, and we could spend all night and maybe all year batting these verses backwards and forwards. There's the two views. View one is sometimes called dispensationalism or Christian Zionism, and it finds support from people like Dr. Darrell Bock of Dallas Theological Seminary, a New Testament scholar, and also my colleague Mark Jury. View two is called covenant theology or federalism, and it finds support from Bishop Tom Wright and also the Reverend Colin Chapman. So both of these views build very strong cases from the Bible, and even within them we find a range of perspectives within these views, or people don't necessarily hold to the same view even within that one group. Our goal today is not to try and resolve these differences. Throughout history, faithful Bible-believing Christians have held quite different views about the relationship between Israel and the land, and yet despite this, they've been able to get along, to worship and serve the Lord together, even in the same churches. Christians can disagree without necessarily being disagreeable. But Christians do agree about what's happened throughout history. The real estate of Israel has always been hotly disputed and ruled by many nations and groups. And I want to talk about particularly what has happened in the land of Israel since the 1st century AD. After the 70 AD revolt by the Jews, the Romans destroyed the temple and massacred 100,000 Jews. Jesus had prophesied that this would happen. In 135 AD, in response to another revolt, the Emperor Hadrian, the Roman Emperor, ordered that all the Jews had to leave Jerusalem, and he renamed it Aelia Capitolina. And he gave the province of Judea the new name Syria-Palestina, which means the Palestinian Syria. And he took this name from the name of the Philistines, one of the tribes that had actually lived in Gaza prior to Israel's conquest of the land, and he was hoping to eradicate any Jewish claim on their holy city. This, by the way, is where the name Palestine came from. It was invented from an earlier name that was there. Of course, the Palestinians of today are not the direct descendants of the Philistines of the past. There were mass deportations and resettlement of other nations in the land under some of the groups that you saw before, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Persians, the Romans, and the Arabs. Each of them brought in their own people or people from other nations. And so any genealogical connection nowadays with the Philistines in the past is pretty unlikely. But the growth of Christianity and the conversion of Constantine and the emperors that were after him meant that the land of Israel became a Christian-ruled land. Many churches were built, and a Christian community lived there for centuries. But Jews continued to live in the land. Sometimes they were in small numbers, maybe as low as 10 or 15% of the population. At other times, they were the majority of people within that area, which was then called Palestine. But in 637, Palestine was occupied by a new group, the Islamic invasion from the Arabian Peninsula, and so many Muslims came and settled there. Now, according to the Hadith and the Sirah, the biographies of Muhammad, Muhammad had actually been to Jerusalem in a miraculous journey a few years before the Muslims came. And so the Temple Mount, where the golden dome of the rock, this building you can see here, and the nearby Al-Aqsa Mosque were built after that. And so this then became the third holiest shrine of Islam. After Mecca and Medina, Jerusalem was the third holiest. So now we have Jews and Christians and Muslims all claiming Jerusalem is a holy place for them. Islam would rule Palestine for nearly 1,300 years, and under the heavy taxation of Jews and Christians, they had a taxation system that differed according to a religion. Many converted to Islam. Now, under classical Islamic law or Sharia, the world is divided into two spheres. There is the home of Islam, the house of submission, Dar al-Islam, and these are the places where Muslims are the authority and where Islam rules. The rest of the world is called the House of War, Dar al-Harb. These are the places where non-Muslims rule and where Islam is not in control. And the Quran teaches, and you can see the verses there on the right, that the only acceptable religion is Islam, and Muslims must fight until everyone has submitted to Islam. Doesn't mean they have to become Muslims. They need to submit to Islamic rule. And Muslims must fight until this happens, and all religion is for Allah alone. And the teaching of most Muslim scholars is that once land is taken for Islam, it could never be handed back. Of course, not all Muslims hold to this teaching, but some Muslims, and particularly radical groups like Hamas, who we'll meet later, clearly believe this, and they are working towards it. So this is the end all as far as these groups are concerned, complete submission of all of the world to Islam. The Jews must be the most consistently persecuted people in history. Sorry, this quote here, this is a quote from a Pakistani scholar who says, Islam resembles the communist structure, would even if it does not oblige people to accept its creed, nevertheless insists on the assumption of political power. Islam is not just a religion, it is a system which involves politics and social matters and legal matters and military matters and ethics and all kinds of things, and politics is a part of it. The Jews must be the most consistently persecuted people in history. They were discriminated against by Christians in Europe and by Muslims in the Middle East and North Africa and Spain. Some Christians refer to them as Christ killers, and the Quran calls them in one place monkeys and swine. And periodically there have been massive pogroms or massacres of thousands, even tens or hundreds of thousands of Jewish people. Been a very long and sad history. And so the idea of finding a secure place for the Jews to live was proposed. They looked at a couple of options. Uganda, Argentina, and Palestine were all considered as possible places for a Jewish homeland. But after the first Zionist conference in Basel in Switzerland in 1897, Palestine got the final vote due to its historical association with the Jews. And so many Jews began to settle in Palestine, buying land and sometimes whole villages or towns from the Ottoman rulers and the Arab landlords. Sometimes this land that they bought had been inhabited by Palestinian tenants that had been there for centuries, and they were evicted. Often it was uninhabited, infertile, swampy or sandy land that nobody else really was interested in. But some Jews opposed the idea of a Jewish state. in 1885, the Pittsburgh Conference of Reformed Jews said, "We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community. And we therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial system under the sons of Aaron, nor any restoration of any of the laws concerning a Jewish state." On one of my visits to Jerusalem, I was walking through the old city and I came across a very large banner hung between two buildings that said, "Judaism and Zionism are diametrically opposed." For them, Judaism was religion, Zionism was politics, and they didn't see any connection between them. In World War I, in 1914, the Ottoman Turks, who were then the Muslim rulers of Palestine, sided with the Germans, and they were defeated. And in 1922, Palestine was placed under British rule or mandate by the League of Nations. This was the precursor to the United Nations. And in 1917, the British government issued what was called the Balfour Declaration. And it said, "His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine." There were not only Muslim Arabs, there were Christian Arabs living in there. In fact, at 1990, about 10% of the population of Palestine were Christians. But the Holocaust in the Second World War saw the extermination of 6 million Jews by the Nazis. And so the process that had been started a couple of decades before brought a massive migration of Jews into Palestine. In 1947, the newly formed United Nations, through Resolution 181, divided the land of Palestine into two independent states. As the Jews moved in, there was conflict between the Jews and the Arabs. And so to resolve this, they decided that they would draw lines and put them into two states. The lands allocated to the Jews were either previously Jewish owned, so land that they bought, or public land, which had not been owned by the government. And the Arabs were allocated mostly Arab-owned land. So they were put into the areas where their people were in a majority. Jerusalem was to be an internationally administered capital for both states. Now, Israel agreed to this arrangement. The Arabs refused to accept what came to be called the two-state solution. But despite this, the Jews announced the formation of the State of Israel on the 14th of May, 1948. The very next day, a large coalition of Arab armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen attacked the Jews. About 700,000 Jews were forced out of the Arab areas that they were in, and the same number of Palestinians were forced out of the Jewish areas. But after a 10-month war, Israel was victorious and actually occupied 70% of the land, the area which had been allocated to the Palestinians, and hence the term the occupied West Bank. You can see there was the Gaza Strip down in the southwestern corner and the West Bank in the eastern part of Jerusalem, but it's west of the Jordan. Gaza and the western half of Jerusalem were also occupied during the 1948 war. 1 million Jews were expelled or left from Arab countries all around the world over the next 3 decades, and 2/3 of them went to Israel. So again, the Jews were on the move and traveling, forced out of countries or traveling out and often coming to Israel. On the other hand, the Palestinians, refugees, moved into camps in the West Bank and in Gaza, in Jordan, in Lebanon and Syria. And I've been to visit them in some of those camps, and they hope to return to those homes one day. There's about 1.5 million Palestinian refugees in these camps in these different countries. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was formed by Yasser Arafat in 1967 to represent all the Palestinians. But a rival Marxist group called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was also formed the same year. Both of these groups were committed to the liberation of Palestine from the Jews by armed struggle, and they engaged in many high-profile terrorist attacks, including hijacking planes, assassinations, and bombings. The fighting continued through much of the 20th century, and in 1967, the Arab nations threatened to invade Israel, and they closed the Suez Canal to Jewish shipping. And Israel launched a surprise preemptive attack on all the surrounding Arab armies, which were massed on their different borders. And in the Six-Day War, Israel seized the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza from Egypt down in the southeast, the West Bank and all of Jerusalem from Jordan. They'd had half of it from the 1948 war, and also the Golan Heights from Syria. The United Nations passed a resolution called Resolution 242, demanding that Israel return to the UN-sanctioned borders, its original borders. Israel eventually returned 90% of the lands occupied during the 67 war. They refused to return the remaining 10%, saying that they needed to control these lands for their own security. Meanwhile, the Palestinians had fractured into various groups. There was the secular PLO and its main faction Fatah, which means victory, but also some radical Islamist groups. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad was formed in 81, Hamas in 1987, and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade in 2002. These groups didn't agree with each other. They had civil wars and they killed each other as well, but they all fought against Israel. So there were many bombings that were going on. None of them accepted the existence of Israel, and all of them pledged to use terrorism to promote their goals. The Oslo Accords were brokered by President Bill Clinton in 1993, and this made an agreement between the PLO and Israel. The West Bank was divided up into a complex patchwork of Palestinian and Israeli-controlled areas called A, B, and C. You can see the colours there in the map on the right-hand side. And the ruling Palestinian Authority, which was mostly ruled by Fatah, by Yasser Arafat's group, agreed to stop all terrorist activity. And for the very first time, the Palestinian group recognized Israel's right to exist. They did subsequently withdraw this recognition in 2018. But with other groups, suicide bombings by Palestinian groups resulted in hundreds of Jewish deaths. Israel responded with strong military action. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, would go into Palestinian areas in large numbers. They would seek to arrest the perpetrators. There would be fighting. They would then take over and demolish the homes of people that had been involved in the violence. And the final death toll of such incursions was typically 3 or more Palestinian deaths for every Jew killed. They exacted a terrible revenge each time this happened. In 2002, to stop the bombings, Israel began the construction of a large separation barrier. It was a massive wall, up to 9 meters high in places and over 700 kilometers long. And as it was constructed, it often cut through Palestinian villages, it separated farmers from their fields, and it was deemed unlawful by the International Court of Justice in 2002. But it did have the effect of almost stopping or radically reducing the number of suicide bombings that were going on in the Jewish-controlled areas. Israel deals with the Palestinians in 2 ways. It's ruled those who live in Palestinian areas such as Gaza and the West Bank with an iron hand. And just the other day, the UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres said, the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economies stifled, their people displaced and their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing. And Israel has been condemned many times, particularly in the United Nations, for its treatment of those living in the West Bank and Gaza. But on the other hand, 22% of Israeli citizens are actually Palestinian Arabs who live in Israel. One time I was hitchhiking through Israel and I got picked up by one of these and he told me he was a Palestinian Muslim, but also a citizen of the Jewish state. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, well, look, as an Israeli citizen, I have full voting rights. I could become a member of the Knesset, the Israeli party, and there are Muslims, Arabs in the Knesset. He said, my fellow Muslims are generals in the Israeli army. Some are ambassadors in Israeli embassies around the world. Some are Supreme Court judges. He said, if I ever lose my job, I'll have, we can collect Israeli unemployment benefits. And when I retire, I will receive an Israeli pension. And he said, I can't have any of these advantages or opportunities if I live in the Palestinian areas. Other Israeli Arabs claim that the implementation of the law always favors the Jews. But this is a kind of a political reality there. Israel handed back Gaza to the Palestinians in 2005. It had occupied it for a period and then handed it back. And in the face of widespread corruption and nepotism by the ruling Palestinian Authority, and particularly by Fatah, Hamas unexpectedly won the Palestinian elections in 2007. They didn't expect to do it. Nobody else expected them to do it. Interestingly, no elections have been held since, or they're supposed to hold one every 3 or 4 years. Hamas was eventually forced into Gaza, where they took control there, and the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas rules the West Bank. But Hamas rules its people quite harshly. 16 years on, it's now unpopular with its people. In a poll taken before October the 7th, only 20% of Gazans said they would vote for Hamas if an election was held. So they are an unpopular rulers. They attempted to implement strict Islamic law, and the people in Gaza said, we didn't vote for this. The Gaza Strip also receives one of the highest levels of international aid per capita in the world. Billions of dollars are poured in for its 2.3 million people. And yet many of its inhabitants, in fact, the majority of its inhabitants, live in dire poverty. And they blame Hamas. Often they point out that their leaders are living in villas in Qatar, and they're living in poverty in Gaza. What's even more interesting, that only 16% of the Gazans blame the external Israeli restrictions. There are border crossings that are monitored by the Jews in the north and Egypt in the south, and you've probably heard about these. But each day, 18,000 Gazans would travel through these and go to Israel for work. Gaza has fought 4 previous wars against Israel, and the attack on October the 7th is simply the latest and the most deadly one. Hamas has claimed that they've fired over 7,500 rockets into Jerusalem. These are worth about $6,000 each on the open market. So that's about $45 million of explosives that have been sent over, quite ineffectively, I should add, because of the Iron Dome defences, that could have been spent on its people. Donors complained that cement and steel that was donated for building schools and hospitals has been used to construct 500 kilometres of underground tunnels where Hamas secretly manufactures and stores explosives. Under President Donald Trump, the Abraham Accords involving mutual recognition and trade were signed by Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan in 2020. And the Palestinians felt that they were being sidelined by such agreements. People were making agreements with Israel and leaving the Palestinians out. And some have suggested that the latest attack on October the 7th was designed to derail upcoming talks of recognition between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But whatever the reason, there can be no justification for the horrific atrocities that Hamas carried out. Early morning on the Sabbath of October the 7th, between 1,500 and 2,000 Hamas militants, terrorists, invaded Israel, and they had orders to kill as many people as they could. These instructions were found on the bodies of some of the fighters that the IDF later killed and by those that they had captured. 1,400 mostly civilian Jews were killed, babies were machine gunned in their cots, women were raped, people were tied up and burnt alive. 2,200 more than Jews were taken back into Gaza as hostages. And by any definition, these are war crimes. But there is actually a context and a precedent for what they did. One of the concerns, the theological concerns that Islamist groups such as Hamas have is the avoidance of what they call in Arabic bid'ah, or innovation. And this is the sin that they consider of doing something that Muhammad or the early Muslims never did, because they are the only ones to be imitated. So the actions carried out by Hamas terrorists are all recorded in the wars and fighting that the first Muslim generation was involved in. And I've got the references there on the side. You can check these, are all taken from authentic Islamic records. But despite this, many other Muslims have criticized Hamas for the action that they took, and they're rightly sickened by the horrible things that happened on that day. People ask, so does Israel have a right to respond? Shouldn't Israel simply declare a ceasefire? Well, last Friday, the UN General Assembly called for, among other things, an immediate ceasefire. Interestingly, Australia abstained. And there's a couple of things that should be said about this. Firstly, the Hamas Charter of 1988 clearly commits the organization to the total destruction of all Jews. Its language is unequivocal. And a new charter was issued in 2017 stating that Hamas is not against the Jewish people, but against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. They don't define who they are. The attack on October 7th showed that this definition included all Israeli citizens, including non-combatants, including women, children, old people. The implication is if Israel did nothing, Hamas would continue on its goal to destroy Israel. That's a part of its charter. The second thing is that the Bible is clear that evil deeds need to be punished. In Romans 13, Paul points out that rulers do not bear the sword in vain. A ruler is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. But there are limits to military action. St. Augustine of Hippo, from a city in modern Algeria, used Roman 13 to develop a concept which is now called the just war theory. And it was built on by an Italian priest, Thomas Aquinas. And it lays down the principles that should be followed in law, in war. And one of them was the minimization of the impact on non-combatants. Israel claims that they are doing this. Israel claims that they are doing this by dropping flyers 10 minutes before a building is going to be bombed. And it also sends text messages where it can to the building's inhabitants, telling them to evacuate immediately. They point out that they have dropped nearly 8,000 bombs on Gaza since the beginning of this conflict. It's caused extensive damage. Those figures are a little bit out of date. It's caused extensive damage, resulting in the loss of about 9,000 lives. So these big bombs, which are designed to destroy 12-story buildings, and typically 1 or 2 people being killed for each time they exploded. The numbers killed by these bombings have been about 0.3% of Gaza's population. These are not just figures, these are human lives. These are young and old people, men and women, non-combatants have been killed. But Hamas also claims that these 8,000 bombs have killed 50 of the hostages it's holding, about 23% of those that they kidnapped from Israel. Now, these numbers are very curious, to say the least. Why is there such a massive discrepancy between the number of Gazans that were killed and the number of hostages that were killed? Hamas has a history of using human shields. That's where I'm meant to go, Joe. Hamas leaders have been telling Gazans not to leave Gaza City, and we have reports of car keys being confiscated and personal goods being taken away from people to prevent them from leaving Gaza. Hamas often locates its offices and stores munitions in or near hospitals and schools and mosques. They have a very clear human shield policy. In fact, this slide shows a Hamas leader boasting about how he had received a phone message that the Israelis were going to bomb his house. So he told his family to all go and stand up on the roof of the house. And the planes went by and they didn't drop any bomb. And he claimed that as a victory. Some claim that the harsh Israeli policies have actually fueled Arab anger, and that's what Antonio Guterres said before, and that's what has made it worse. But I think it's important to state that even if you believe that Israel has a right to be in the land, as the view one did, the top view I talked before, that doesn't mean that you can't question the actions of the Jews. The Old Testament and the New Testament both contain strong criticisms of the Jewish nation, even when they were considered the people of God. And so we need to separate this concept of a divinely conferred identity from sinful and unjust actions. All criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism, just as all criticism of Hamas is not Islamophobia. Jesus said we need to judge a tree by its fruits, and I should add, not by its label. Jews and Christians are dying in this terrible tragedy, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And every life is of equal value before God because God created them all. Everyone is his beloved child by virtue of creation. Peace won't come until all the groups recognize the right of the others to exist and accept the two-state solution. The Jews are not going to go anywhere. The Palestinians are not. They need to learn how to live side by side. But could this upcoming war stop? Adolf Hitler claimed that the occupation of Germany after World War I and the heavy reparations that the German people were required to pay after World War I was the justification for his invasion of Poland. And as a result, Europe was taken hostage by the Nazis and the extermination camps were set up and people began to be killed. Hamas makes the same claim. They claim the occupation of their land by the Jews and the economic sanctions are a justification for their invasion on October 7th. And they took 222 hostages and have threatened to kill them one by one. On June 16th in 1944, nearly 1 million Allied troops were stationed ready to invade Normandy. And the Nazis could have prevented the terrible killing that was going to happen over the next year before V-Day by simply setting free all of those that were held in their death camps and surrendering for trial by an international war tribes tribunal. But they refused to do so. They were inspired by a bigoted ideology which told them that they were the superior race and they had a destiny to rule the world. Of course, all Germans did not believe this. They were helpless pawns in this, and so they became the victims. 15 million soldiers killed, 38 million civilians killed in World War II. The bloodshed went on because of Hitler and the Nazis' refusal to surrender. Today, 300,000 Jewish soldiers, some of them descendants of those who suffered in the Nazi death camps, are massed on the border of Gaza, and they are ready to invade. Hamas could stop this tomorrow by setting free all of the hostages and surrendering to the International Criminal Court. But they're unlikely to do so. Islamist groups like Hamas quote verses from the Quran. Here's one: "You are the best of peoples ever evolved for humanity." And this gives them a sense of superiority and a sense of entitlement, and also a confidence of final victory. Of course, all Palestinians don't do this, and so they too are helpless pawns in this terrible battle that's going on. They are and they will be the victims of this war. Bloodshed will go on. It seems almost we've got nowhere to go. From a Christian perspective, we believe that true peace can only be found in Jesus. He is the Prince of Peace. He is the ultimate peacemaker. He showed this by the way that he lived. Amongst his 12 disciples were 2 men. Simon was a zealot, and the zealots were a terrorist group which was famous for its guerrilla warfare against the Roman occupiers. Another apostle was Matthew. He was a collaborator. He collected taxes from the Jews to give to the Romans. And only Jesus can bring 2 such different people together. These 2 men turned away from the lives that they had been involved in, their lives of violence, their lives of oppression of others, and they came to Jesus and he transformed their hearts. And Jesus is the one who broke down the dividing wall between Jew and Gentile. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons and daughters of God." And Jesus' followers, no matter what their views on history or their view of theology or their view of eschatology, need to work towards peace and reconciliation and justice for all people. And so as God's people, we need to pray for peace and to work for peace in whatever ways we can. But Jesus' peace is not just an external absence of war. We'd love to see that happening in the Middle East. We'd love to see it stop tomorrow. But Jesus' peace is an internal heart transformation that sees all lives of equal value and works towards what Jesus called abundant life. This is a 360-degree peace, which involves peace with God, peace with ourselves, peace with our families and friends and colleagues, and even peace with our enemies if they are ready to accept that. And only Jesus can do this. This is the true gospel of peace. This is what our calling as Christians is, to take this gospel of peace into the world and to see lives and hearts and communities transformed by that, transformed by Jesus. May he help us as we seek to do that. Thank you. I'll hand you back to Dennis now, and he will continue.
Thank you very much, Bernie, for this great presentation. And we will start a Q&A session in a couple of minutes. So I will just let Bernie to have some time to have a look at the questions. So if you have any questions, this is the time where you can ask it. We will have time till roughly maybe 8:30. And also, if you have a chance, have a look at the chat. There is a link there to the page with more information about the Arthur Jeffrey Center and what we are doing. So there are, if you haven't joined from the very beginning, so there are a few upcoming webinars. One in 2 weeks' time with Dr. Mark Dury, which is, and this webinar will be focusing on the current Middle Eastern conflicts, like the Israeli-Palestinian one. And he will be talking about how these types of conflicts affect the local Christians and how we can support our Christians, brothers and sisters in the Middle East. And there are also going to be an online and on-campus event in March next year with Dr. Bernie Power. He will be talking about using storytelling as a tool to reach to Muslims, to evangelize Muslims. So if you go to the chat and you follow the link, there will be several links there, links to both of these events, so you can register for them already. There will be a link to the AJC page if you would like to find more about the Arthur Jeffrey Center. And Arthur Jeffrey Center is the center of excellence at the Melbourne School of Theology. So Melbourne School of Theology is a non-for-profit organization. And if you would like to see more webinars like that, please consider donating. There is a donation link on that page as well. And also there is a box there where you can suggest topics for future webinars. So if you would like to hear something about the Christianity or Islam or Christian-Muslim relations, please give us your suggestions. We would love to see them. And I will hand it back to Bernie now, and he can start answering questions. Thank you, Bernie.
Okay. All right. I'll just answer the questions in the order that they're coming to me, and give them kind of the best. Okay. Just attempt that I can. So the first one is, the opponents of Israel often talk about occupied land in the West Bank and Gaza. I thought that Israel left Gaza in 2005. What is the truth? Yes. Israel had occupied it in the 1967 war. They handed it back in 2005. There were actually Jewish people living in the land at that time. They forcibly withdrew them back into Israeli ruled territory. The term occupied land only refers to the West Bank. So the places, because they did not completely withdraw to the 1948 barriers, it will always be referred to by the United Nations as the occupied West Bank. So that's the test there. And the comment of Palestinians would be like, even if they're not there, they still control the borders through army checkpoints. There are roads that go through the West Bank that are only for Jewish people. They're building settlements on land that was allocated to the Palestinians in the West Bank, and so that's part of the reason for the endurance of this title. Next question. Doesn't the whole land of Israel belong to the Jews? Didn't God give the land to them? So the question would be, where do you stand on your theology? If you take a dispensationalist or a Christian Zionist view, that's undisputable. You would say, yes, it does. If you hold a covenant theology view, then you would say that the land had been given to the Jews for a purpose. They were not able to fulfill that purpose, or they didn't fulfill that purpose. So all of the promises that were given to the Jews found their yes in Jesus. And so he then comes, and Paul refers to the church as the new Israel, the new circumcision. And so the covenant theologians take all of those references from the Old Testament and apply them to the church, and that the promises of the land have been fulfilled in Jesus. It's a difficult one, but you can go and read up on both of those views. Even if many people make up modern-day Israel are genealogical descendants of Abraham, given what has happened since the destruction of the temple, is it legitimate to view the secular state of modern Israel as maintaining the same status as Israel in the Bible? And that's the conflict between the two views, which is why I put them up there. I hope I gave them both equal time. That view one, the dispensationalist view, would say it always belongs to them, effectively no matter what. And view two, the covenant theology, would take the kind of view. So after the temple was destroyed, it no longer has the same status. Israel no longer has the same status that it had in the Old Testament. Some of them would say, and again, I mentioned there's a range of views within these, amongst the covenant theologians, they would say Paul talked about in Romans 11 about the Jews, all of Israel being saved, and they believe that there will be a big influx of Jews into the church. But they say it doesn't have to happen in Jerusalem. It can happen here in Melbourne, as it is with the Messianic congregations. That doesn't need the rebuilding of the temple in order for that to happen. So that would be the approach they'd take with that one. Yeah. Could you comment on why other Muslim states like Egypt, Jordan, etc., aren't accepting refugees from Palestine? Well, actually, Jordan does. When I lived in Jordan, most of our neighbours were Palestinians, so had come there as refugees. But now, and Egypt has closed their border, the Rafah crossing has been closed. They don't want to see a massive influx of 1 million or 2 million refugees coming into Egypt. It's just a massive drain on the on their economy, on their infrastructure. And the other thing is that Egypt doesn't like Hamas. They classify them as a terrorist organization. Hamas not only would attack Israel, but they also would go into Egypt, and they killed many soldiers and are involved in a whole lot of things. Egypt is seen as a much more middle-of-the-road Islamic nation. Hamas comes from the radical right-wing end, the fundamentalist end of Islam, and they are at odds with each other. So Egypt wants to try and minimize their impact. Israeli policy regarding the settlements in the West Bank is often invoked as a reason for continued conflict. Can you give some broad commentary about this? Yes. So part of it is the settlements. Okay, right. So these would be Israeli settlements. Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking of Palestinian settlements. Yeah, so the land that has been was allocated by the United Nations in 1948 as part of Palestine. The UN and Palestinians claim that Israel has no right to any of that land. But Israeli groups have been building settlements there, sometimes illegally, and sometimes the Israeli government has actually gone in and bulldozed those settlements. They might just start as a little camp in an area, and then they start building houses. They have bulldozed some of them, but many of them have been allowed, some given legal right to stay there and to build and to occupy it. So that's a really difficult question on why the Jews would be allowed to do that. It's been challenged by the Supreme Court. Sometimes I think it's been told that they couldn't build, but the Palestinians will try and challenge this as much as possible. But it is a very sore point with the Palestinians. Isn't Islamic eschatology, including the future possession of Jerusalem, ruling the world, abolishing crosses and pigs, a problem standing in the way of lasting peace with Muslims who are committed to their Quran and Sunnah? This is a real problem. And again, like with any group, Islam is a spectrum. So you'll have the very hardline, radical kind of literalist ones who will say Islam will take over the world, will rule. And then you get the traditionalists who say, as long as we can carry out our religion, we're happy. And then you get the more liberals who say, we think we can live at peace with anyone. We could live in a two-state solution. We could live with Jewish friends. And they do. So don't think that Islam is just this single kind of a monolith. There's always within it a fair bit of discussion. And so people will read Islamic eschatology in different ways and change in their views of what the claims are and the expectations are. Some say, well, that was true, might have been true in Muhammad's time, it no longer applies now, and we need to rethink these. So there are movements within there, but the literalists, the radicals, will say, this is where history is going, and this is what we need to be involved in. And they're willing to sacrifice their lives for that. Is there potential for this event to escalate into a regional war, given Psalm 83 and Zechariah 12? Yes, there is. And watching the military movements of the US Navy, they've put a couple of their battleships into the Mediterranean, and they're concerned that Iran will try and turn it into a regional conflict. Iran has got proxy groups such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they've also been supplying Hamas with weapons. Some of the things that are coming over, flying into Israel, are Iranian-made or manufactured, or get the parts from them. And some think that the attack on October the 7th may have actually been planned within Iran. So it's possible that if Hezbollah attack from the north, then it will turn into a regional warfare. My own place I used to live, Yemen, has actually sent a couple of bombs over from Yemen to try and land in Israel. They were intercepted by the Saudis and shot down. So there is that real possibility that it will turn into that. Israel is going very slowly, much more slowly than I expected, into Gaza, whereas I expected that there would be a big Russian attempt. They're just going in kind of in incremental steps and trying to overcome bit by bit. But we'll see what happens over the coming days. I think this next 24, 48 hours will be a big one. The fact that the US is kind of very unequivocal in its support of Israel could maybe put a limit on this. There's a lot of talking going on, and yeah. Does the use of human shields qualify for indiscriminate bombing? I'm not sure what that means. It says quality. Maybe are you saying, maybe you're saying that because even though they use human shields, does that mean indiscriminate bombing is allowed? My thinking would be no. If you're going to go for a target, it needs to be a military target of something of value. And Israel claims that's what they're doing. They're saying we don't drop our bombs on housing centers. The bomb, for example, on the El Ahli hospital has been now shown it was a failed Islamic jihad bomb, rocket that fell apart and it collapsed into the car park. Israel saying our bombs hit buildings and we make very big craters. This was just a 30 centimeter indentation in the earth that was heading from the south to the north. It was not ours. In addition to praying for peace, advice about what we should pray. Just pray for changes in hearts. Having lived with Arabs for a long time, often their hatred for Israel is it's built into them from a very young age. Hamas is really skilled at doing this, and if you go online and Google Hamas children's programs, and you can see the terrible things that they're teaching their children to do from a very young age. And just for the breaking down, this is satanic, really. Hamas is rightly classified as a terrorist organization. That's what they're doing. They don't have a sense of a moral compass in terms of considering people. They dehumanize, and just horrible to see that. Just pray that God would turn those things around in their hearts. How can we accept unequivocal support of Israel's continuous bombing? It is a crime. And I think that's important that, as I mentioned before, the Old Testament and the New Testament were both willing to criticize Israel for its actions. And as we see actions that are happening that are unacceptable, we need to call them out, whoever does them. There's never a sense of, oh, well, it's okay because they did it. I think that's an important point. Thank you. How do Palestinian Christians view the state of Israel and their feelings about the present situation? Mark Jury will be talking more about this in a couple of weeks' time. The figures are very interesting. In 1900 AD, about 10% of the population of Palestine were Christian. Those numbers have changed drastically. In Gaza, which has got 2.3 million people, there's only about 1,000 Christians live. Most of them have left. Some have been killed. I know there's been attacks on places, but some were there. And an Israeli bomb landed on a building next door to a church, and the wall collapsed, and 18 were killed last week. Great tragedy. Others, and in the West Bank, the number of Christians is about 2.5%. Interestingly, in Israel, in the Israeli Jewish controlled lands, Christians are about 8% of the population and growing. And a Jew once said to me, Israel is the only country in the Middle East where the church is actually growing, where the numbers are increasing. Palestinian Christians take two views on it. Some are very clearly opposed to the Jewish action, and they call them the Zionists. Others are a bit more open. A lot of them are actually working for reconciliation between Jew and Gentile. And you see there's groups like Masalaha, which is reconciliation in Arabic, which would do that. They'll bring Christians and Muslims and Jews together. So it's not just an ideology, but you're talking face to face with a real person. It's a great approach. Okay. Israel has bombed relentlessly. They tell people to go to the south and then bomb the south. Yes, that's what happens. So Israel had dropped all these leaflets, the ones that I showed you, on the north, telling people, in fact, that one had implied that if you stayed in the north, then you were kind of supporting Gaza and the terrorists, although Israel said that was a mistranslation. And there was some bombing in the south. It hasn't been anything like the extent that it's been happening in the north, but it has been happening. And Israel claims that they're only going after military targets. One of the real problems with this whole thing is we're only getting the views of these two perspectives. Israel controls the narrative from their side. Hamas controls the narrative from its side. And it's, we don't know actually how many people were killed. We only have reports from what they said, how many people were killed. We don't know how many bombs were fired, only what they report as being fired. So we're not, there's not total openness, and there never has been in this. They talk about the first casualty of war is the truth, and we're experiencing that now. It's quite sad. Got another one coming up there. Sorry, I can't see all the things there. Okay. Someone had a comment there about Hamas being a word which means zeal. The word actually is an acronym from the letters of their organization. It's called Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, the Islamic resistance movement. But it also means zeal, enthusiasm. Do we have others that are coming up? Looks like it stopped. Okay. I might just go back to some that have been commented on about a two-state solution ever being achieved, while Palestinians demand East Jerusalem as their capital. Can't see Israel ever agreeing to it, and that's a real tricky one. And again, Mark Jury will talk about that in a couple of weeks' time. So let's just be aware. There's more information coming your way if you want to do that or look at that. Coming down. The Malaysian Prime Minister publicly announced unwavering support for Hamas and introduced a Palestinian solidarity program amongst school kids. Some schools have had their kids stomp on the Israeli flag. Others made kids dress like Hamas and carry plastic weapons. Observing what has happened elsewhere, for example, Dagestan, it looks like this is a Muslim versus Jew conflict. Do you agree, and why? It certainly is. That's certainly a strong element in it. The issues that kind of make it religious is the position of Jerusalem as a holy city. Someone asked me the other day also, did this just start when the British allowed the Jewish immigrants to come into Palestine? And I said, actually, it started a long way before that. If you go back into early Islamic history, when Muhammad moved from Mecca to Medina, there was a couple of Jewish tribes living in Medina, and his expectation was that they would accept him as a prophet and they would become Muslim. Well, the Jews didn't do this. They mocked him because of his lack of education. Muhammad was illiterate, and they opposed him. And there were even claims that they made a death threat or a death attempt on his life. And so Muhammad turned against them. And you see this really strong theme within the Quran. If you read it chronologically, initially he's very positive about the Jews and the Christians, and then he becomes a little bit more equivocal about the Jews, positive about the Christians, and then later on he becomes more negative about the Jews, and then ultimately about the Christians as well. So this theme is in the Quran, and it actually reflects what Muhammad was doing, or what was happening to Muhammad. As he received more opposition from the Jews, then he became more opposed to them. And so within the city of Medina, when he moved in 622, there was a sizable population. 5 years later, every Jew had been either exiled or enslaved or executed. So he basically cleared them out. And so that animosity has continued throughout history. There have been times when Jews and Muslims have lived together peaceably. That's been the case. But if you look, as the fundamentalists do, at the early documents, the Quran, the Sirah, the Hadith, then they'll pick up this very negative anti-Jewish commentary. Why don't they let out citizens from other countries from Gaza? Yeah, and that the point that I made. Why don't they let everybody out? And it's part of a hostage-taking policy that they will do. Hamas has done this before. They've captured Israeli soldiers and typically exchanged them for Palestinian prisoners. Do the Jews believe in the same God as the Christians? I don't believe that they do. From a Christian perspective, if we recite the Apostles' Creed, I believe in God the Father, creator of heaven and earth, in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. Jews, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, crucified, died, and was buried. Jews do not accept the fatherhood of God, the sonship of Christ, the death and the resurrection of Christ. And those are pretty basic kinds of things from a Christian perspective. I don't believe that we worship the same God. Do you believe that Mossad didn't know about the attack that Hamas planned? This is so confusing to me. The Israeli intelligence, it was really top-notch. I can't understand how this happened. The only explanation that I can give would be that Benjamin Netanyahu was been in great political trouble. He's actually being charged, so he's got a court case up against him. And he was attempting to change the way that the Supreme Court judges were put in place. And there were massive demonstrations against him. Thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even more, out on the streets regularly. But what was important was that army reservists were refusing to turn up for duty. And so the IDF was probably operating at a lower level than it did normally. They probably thought that Gaza wouldn't attack, and so maybe Gaza took them by surprise. I don't know, but I find that one just very, very confusing. Surely it's time for the international community to be honest and recognize the two-state solution is dead in the water. Any future resolution needs a rethink. Yeah, it's a hard one. They've been at it now, for 80 years, since 1948. And for most of that time, it hasn't been accepted by the Palestinians. They're the ones, and even now, no Palestinian group is saying we're going to agree to the two-state solution. So until both sides at least nominally agree to it, then we're not going to see any resolution, and it's hard to know how to go forward with this. And that's why I said that's only the transforming power of Jesus can actually solve this problem. It's just, horrible. Why is every Muslim in the world united only for Palestine in spite of the many differences within themselves? There is a saying called, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And for them, the fact that they've see Israel as a common enemy, they'll often work together with others that they wouldn't normally agree with. And I mentioned before, the Palestinians have often fought with each other. There have been civil wars, often fought out on the streets of Gaza, where Hamas and Islamic Jihad and al-Fatah have been fighting each other. When Israel comes along, then they've now got a common enemy, and they combine together to fight against them. Okay. All right. What options does Israel have when it's attacked by an enemy that isn't interested in peaceful negotiations? This is really hard. Benjamin Netanyahu famously proclaimed, if Hamas put down their guns, there would be no more war. And he said, if Israel put down their guns, there would be no more Israel. So there's this real sense of, how do you negotiate with somebody who is totally committed to your destruction? It has happened. So we have seen things like the Oslo Accords, where Yasser Arafat signed an agreement not to be involved in terrorism anymore, and they held that for a couple of years. And I think it probably needs some new leadership on both sides who have the courage to somehow put the history, the past behind them, and say, let's start anew, let's begin again, and seek for the welfare of our people. I read somewhere that Islam spread through the Muslim immigrants all over the world, taking advantage of the democracy of these countries. What is their view that Muslims will overtake Christians at some point? Certainly, and I know some Muslims who are quite committed to that. They tell me to my face that they will take over Australia. Fortunately, they're a minority, and they're often not taken seriously by other Muslims, and they would say these guys are the crazies. But you know that could change. That can turn around, and I think it's important that we be aware of that there is this kind of ideology that's out there, and be willing to respond to it. The important thing: don't put all Muslims into that category. Don't treat them all as enemies. Muslim neighbours living around me. I'm buying from a Muslim shop today. We've had Muslims living with us here. So it's important you treat them as individuals, humanize them. And that's what the incarnation is all about, that God actually took on human flesh and came down here and lived amongst us and went through all the things that we go through. And it's important that we be able to do that with our neighbours, be the peacemakers, with these, recognizing that there are people who will have these very dangerous and lethal kind of ideologies that we also need to stand up against. So we need to be, as Jesus says, be as wise as serpents, but as innocent as doves. Is hatred for Israel and its desire for destruction a core tenet of the Islamic faith that's shared by most Muslims globally, or is it limited to the radical extremist fringe? And again, I mentioned there's this spectrum. So you'll have some very liberal Muslims who will say, in fact, there are people who are saying, not in our name, this didn't happen according to our religious tenets. We believe that Islam is a religion of peace. And I think then we should let them hold to that and work with them to seek and to act against the radical, the extremist fringe, because they won't give up on those until something radically changes their minds. There are stories. You can read the testimony of a man called the son of Hamas, whose father was a Hamas leader, and how he came to Christ. Jesus can do that work, and he does do that work of transforming individuals. And I think it's important to recognize that. If Gaza is occupied by non-extremist Muslims and Christians as well as Hamas adherents, is there evidence of an internal resistance movement there as there was in Europe under the Nazis? It's a very good question. Hamas is brutal. They execute lots of people. And one of the comments about a Shifa hospital, there was an international medical person working there. They said, we knew that some of the rooms had been taken over by Hamas for torturing and executing prisoners. Typically, they were prisoners from Fatah, the rival organization, or they may have been Gazans who they suspected of collaborating with Jews. So there may be a resistance movement within Gaza. But they would be in the same place as the resistance movement fighting against the Nazis. Their lives would be very much in danger. Who's going to make Israel accountable for their actions if they simply ignore all official complaints and the United Nations vetoing to halt the bombs? The only way Israel will listen to America. They receive a lot of their support from America. A lot of their weaponry comes from America, and they will respond to them. The fact that Israel is going into Gaza in a gradual kind of way, I think, may be in response to American requests that they try and save as many hostages as possible and try and limit the number of civilian deaths. So there needs to be someone who can put pressure on them, just as there needs to be someone who can put pressure on Hamas. An interesting player in all of this is Qatar, this Arab nation, the one that hosted the World Cup soccer last year. They have strong links with Hamas. In fact, Hamas has its political headquarters in Qatar. And they can put pressure on Gaza to do things as well. So sometimes it's a matter of working with these different groups and trying to get them to put pressure on the groups there. do you think that after this war, more Muslims will join Hamas? This is one of the problems with if you have groups. So after 9/11, we saw this massive upsurge in support for radical Islam. So hundreds of Australian citizens actually went over there to fight with ISIS when they eventually got going. And so sometimes victory in war is a very productive way of recruiting more people for your cause. So I think that's, there's a real danger of that kind of developing out of control. Can you tell us the Islamic view of the elimination of Israel from the river to the sea? Yeah, at the demonstrations, you'll hear people reciting this: Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. That's from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And the expectation, the kind of subtext of this is that the Jews will be taken out of it. So it is really a call for the destruction of all of the Jews, or the removal of all the Jews within Palestine, Israel. Do you really believe that Israel is acting in self-defense, or is it committing genocide? Okay, so a couple of things in here. Acting in self-defense, and again with the just war theory, you were allowed to occupy or invade another country if you believe that it could have like preemptive or longer term impact. That was an acceptable thing, but not to the extent of committing genocide. So the idea of going in and killing non-combatants was never a part of it. And so if Israel gets involved in that, as they start doing that, and some people believe that's already happening, then they need to be called account for that. So rather than simply saying, oh, well, this is the cost that needs to be paid, there's much more sophisticated military approaches that could be used, and we need to call people to that. But again, realizing that Hamas will be using suicide bombers, they will be using human shields. They'll use every possibility of people that are committed to their idea. Isn't the repeated comprehensive military thrashing Israel dishes out to the Arabs clear proof of God's blessing of view one? It's interesting, Muslims have often used this argument that the fact that Islam, by 1500, within 100 years, Islam occupied 2/3 of Christendom when they came out of the Arabian Peninsula in 632 AD. By 732 AD, they had occupied all of the Middle East, North Africa, and they'd actually gone across and occupied Spain and Portugal, as well as moving up into Turkey. All the Stan countries moved across to Afghanistan. They had this massive, that kind of 10 times, more than 10 times their territory within it. And they said, this is a sign that Allah is with us. So we need to again go back into the Old Testament and see that there were actually defeats. Israel did lose some of their victories. So it's not always, God doesn't just put a stamp on a people and say, you can go and do whatever you want, no matter what. Jeremiah went out onto the streets and he said to the people, there is judgment coming on our nation because of our sins. And he said, don't say to me, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. Just because God has chosen you and given you special privileges does not mean that you can do whatever you like. It does not mean that he will back you without any conditions. And I think that's why we have a right to be able to call Israel to account for the things that they do. And of course, Hamas too. Ray, letting people out of Gaza, it means Western citizens, not hostages. So that was an answer to the previous one. So why isn't Hamas doing that? They're doing it because they want to be able to maintain the kind of strategic advantage that they have. They know that while ever there are Western hostages in there, then the countries of the West will be lobbying Israel not to go and put their citizens at danger. Is the current Muslim-Jewish animosity derived from Ishmael, that he will be against everyone and everyone will be against him? Certainly people have looked at that. There is a kind of a question mark about how much the Arabs of today are descended from Ishmael. I've done a bit of work on this, a bit of research there. Muhammad's connection with Ishmael is tenuous at the best. There was about 2,500 years between them, and Muhammad's genealogies, well, there's 13 genealogies, all of them miraculously end back at Ishmael because that's where he wanted them to end. But it's pretty unlikely that he was actually descended from Ishmael based on the information that we have. But certainly there is a spirit that has gone in there, and this idea of division. There is an Arab proverb that says, I against my brothers, I and my brothers against our cousins, I and my cousins against the world. And so this whole idea of animosity is kind of built into the psyche. And if you live in Muslim countries, that's what you see. They're often quite a belligerent in many ways. Oops. Oh, it just dropped somewhere. Have I lost connection? Yeah.
No, Bernie, you haven't lost connection. We can still see and hear you.
Okay, yeah. All right. A statement I heard today from a Jewish lady on the ground in Israel. She has a copy of the letter being dropped on northern Gaza. It states, if you don't want to leave, put your hands up or show a white flag, then follow IDF instructions. It says, don't worry about food or water. You will be provided. Just relaying this comment from a Jewish online radio station, not mainstream media. Yeah. Thanks for passing that on. There's been a whole lot of misinformation with this thing. We saw pictures that were fabricated and whatever about the claims that were made by both sides. So it's important to do that. And I always say, let's get some kind of proof about this before we put it out there as something that has really happened. But that would be a positive thing if that was going to happen. Who is going to make Hamas accountable for the Holocaustal type massacre that they perpetrated on October the 7th? Interesting, the Jews are saying this was the greatest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust in one event. And they're calling, and they're saying, our job is to go in and make Hamas accountable for what they've done. So they're going in and they plan to take over the whole place and bring to trial or destroy the people responsible, and to make sure that Hamas can never rise again. It's interesting. It happened with ISIS. The whole world got behind ISIS, and they got behind the opposition to ISIS and said this group should not be allowed to operate. And from my perspective, Hamas is exactly in the same thing. They've got the same ideology. They've got the same approaches. They haven't been beheading people online as ISIS did, but the kind of beliefs and their expectations and their goals and their methods are the same. Should we rethink about how we view our beliefs? It might be idealistic, but if we all accept that we all believe in the same God, that is not Jesus, the world would be a more peaceful place. Well, that means sacrificing truth on the altar of expediency. To simply say that we all believe in the same God in order that we might have peace is not true, but also it's not effective, because we see within religious groups, even when they do believe in the same God, then you're still going to get fighting. And I mentioned about amongst the Palestinian factions. Of course, it's happened with Christians too. World War II, we believed in the same God, but still fought against each other. So just saying, well, we all believe in the same God is not going to make the world a more peaceful place. So that's a kind of a hopeful, but a little bit idealistic, as you say. Some dispensationalists seem to be undermining the peace effort in order to fulfill the rebuilding of the temple. Do they constitute the majority amongst US evangelicals? Don't know if they constitute the majorities, but they certainly are a powerful group. And the fact that Donald Trump got involved in the Abraham Accords, I think, was due to the influence of US evangelicals upon him. He's not a man who showed much interest in foreign policy or even support of the Jews prior, but he picked this up, and then he got the US embassy to move from up to Jerusalem and established it there. It's still there, by the way, under the current president. So, there's dispensationalism can actually have an impact on foreign policy. And I think that's kind of playing into this whole thing, and particularly the kind of rock solid support for Israel that's usually coming out of the US would be a reflection of that. Warning. Yeah. I don't quite understand this. Warning, ABC program, if you're listening, went into the intelligence. A warning had come from Egypt but was ignored. Okay, that's interesting. So someone here claiming that Israel had been warned that an attack was coming by Egypt, but they ignored it. Is there anything in Israel's power to do other than potentially destroying Hamas that would make the situation fundamentally better? There could be ways of working better with the Palestinians. Now, I talked about that situation of Palestinian Arabs and the kind of policies that they benefit from. There are other things that Israel does do. For example, Israeli hospitals will accept people from the Palestinian territories who have been injured. One of the two older ladies that were returned was her role, her thing that she did was getting Palestinian kids into Israeli hospitals. So that happens. But just trying to seek this face-to-face contact, and it does happen. I visited Jerusalem several times, and mostly I lived in Palestinian areas because I speak Arabic. Occasionally I lived in Jewish areas as well. And the relationships between the two from day to day, you would go to an Arab shop, the next door would be a Jewish shop, and they would talk to each other. People from both sides would go into both shops. It wasn't something that innately meant that they could not get on, because they did, and they have, and they can. So I think it's important to recognise that and to try and work with those. So the reconciliation groups are very important in this process. And as Christians, we can be the mediators, and Christians are taking that mediatorial role, being the peacemakers that Jesus called us to.
Bernie, maybe just one more final question.
Okay, all right. Okay. This is a great one to end up with. Sometimes I like to imagine what it would look like for the kingdom of God to come in this space. And we have these really positive pictures that we see of what the world will be like when Jesus establishes the new kingdom. I might just read a little bit from Isaiah just to finish up. Excuse me, here in Isaiah 11, he talks about this. All right. This one, it says, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, from his roots a branch. The branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, nor decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. And with the breath of his lips, he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. The wolf will lie with the lamb, will live with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat. The calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear. Their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put its hand into the viper's nest. They will neither fear, neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And that's our hope as Christians, just to see the kingdom of God coming in its fullness, where not only people, but also nature is all reconciled and just built into that beautiful place that God has meant it to be in, and has called us to get involved in. Let's just pray that happens. Thank you.
That's a good idea, Bernie. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for tonight. Thank you that so many Christians here have gathered because we care. We care what's happening in the Middle East. We care what's happening with your people. But beyond that, we care what's happening to the Jewish people, to the Palestinian people, to all the smaller people groups as well that are unseen and are also suffering. And we thank you, Lord, that we know that you are the Prince of Peace and that the message of the gospel is the ultimate solution. We recognize that the politics are messy and the history is messy and the relationships are messy. But we pray that Jesus' peace would somehow miraculously, and especially through your people who are there being salt and light, would reach out and show them a better way. So we thank you for tonight. Please answer our prayers for Israel. And we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for joining us. I'll hand over to Dennis in a second just to wind up and let you know about recordings and things like that. But the AJC exists so we can help the church and equip the church to be able to engage with Islam, both in terms of mission, but also in terms of things like this, socially and politically. So we really hope that this has helped you in that way. We got many other offerings, more seminars coming up, and also there are subjects that you can come and study at MST that will give you more insight into Islam.